London, in the closing decades of the 19th century, was the beating heart of empire, a city swollen with trade, shadowed by poverty, and restless with change. Yet in the autumn of 1888, its East End became the stage for a sequence of killings so grotesque that they unsettled even a population long accustomed to hardship. One by one, women of the district, destitute, vulnerable, unseen by the city at large, were found mutilated with a precision both brutal and deliberate. The figure who carried out these acts became etched in history under a name still whispered: Jack the Ripper. A vast manhunt followed, dragging constables, surgeons, and citizens into a maze of false leads and sudden panic. The murders ceased as abruptly as they began, leaving only fragments, bloodied cobblestones, contradictory testimonies, and a silence that has never been resolved. This is not merely a tale of a killer, but of a city confronted with its own shadows, of an investigation that birthed more questions than answers, and of a mystery that endures across centuries. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Do not forget to subscribe and like, so you never miss the next descent into the hidden archives of history. In the East End of London lay Whitechapel, a district where overcrowded lodging houses and shadowed alleys formed a city within the city. By the 1880s, it was a quarter synonymous with poverty, unemployment, and desperation. Police patrols moved constantly through its narrow passages, yet crime remained a nightly expectation rather than an exception. One such passage was George Yard. At its north entrance stood the George Yard Buildings, a block of tenements that rose above the slum streets. On the morning of August 7th, 1888, a resident named John Reeves descended from his room to leave for work. At the first-floor landing, he was halted by a sight that froze him where he stood. The body of a woman sprawled on her back, her clothes disordered, her form surrounded by blood. Reeves stumbled into the street below, where he summoned Constable Thomas Barrett. Within minutes, Dr. Timothy Killeen arrived to examine the corpse. His assessment was brief and grim. The woman had been stabbed no fewer than 39 times, most wounds concentrated upon the chest and abdomen. He judged she had been dead for roughly 3 hours, placing the moment of death around 2:30 a.m. There was no evidence of the body being moved. The attack had occurred exactly where she lay, upon the landing of a crowded building where no tenant reported hearing a disturbance. One exception was Amy Hewitt, a neighbor who recalled a solitary cry of murder earlier that evening. Yet she dismissed it, remarking that such cries were common in Whitechapel, so frequent that they scarcely stirred alarm. The victim was soon identified as Martha Tabram, 39 years old, a mother of 2 long estranged from her husband. Her last known address was a lodging house on George Street, scarcely 300 meters from where she died. Survival in her circumstances depended upon prostitution and one of her known comers. Panion's was Mary Ann Connolly. Connolly testified that on the night of August 6th, she and Tabram had spent the evening drinking with 2 soldiers. Near midnight, the group separated, Connolly leading one soldier into Angel Alley, while Tabram departed with the other into George Yard. That was the last moment Connolly saw her alive. Later, around the same hour, Constable Barrett noted a soldier loitering near the north entrance of George Yard. The man explained he was waiting for his mate who had gone away with a girl. Half an hour beyond that encounter, Martha Tabram lay dead. Both Connolly and Barrett were asked to identify the soldiers, but each pointed to the wrong men. Alibis closed every avenue, one soldier with his wife, another confined to barracks, a third far from Whitechapel. Inspector Edmund Reed, leading the investigation, dismissed the line of inquiry. Having both picked out the wrong men, they could not be trusted again, as their evidence would be worthless. Even had a soldier been guilty, no motive could be discerned. Whitechapel was no stranger to violence, but the ferocity of the wounds suggested a brutality without reason. Newspapers echoed the sentiment, "The crime is one of the most brutal that have occurred for some years." At the inquest on August 23rd, the coroner concluded, "For a poor defenseless woman to be outraged and stabbed in such a manner is almost beyond belief." It was a judgment that seemed final. Yet within days, Whitechapel would discover that this was only the beginning. On the morning of August 31st, 1888, Robert Paul departed his home on Foster Street to begin his workday. Turning into Bucks Row, he noticed a figure standing in the road. The man, later identified as Charles Cross, called to him, "Come and look over here. There is a woman lying on the pavement." Together they approached. The woman's hands were already cold, and Cross concluded she was dead. Paul, leaning closer, thought he detected a faint trace of breath. Yet neither sought help immediately. Pressed by the urgency of their employment, they chose to continue their route, resolving to alert a policeman. They soon encountered Constable John Neal, patrolling nearby with lantern in hand. At the spot indicated, Neal found the woman lying on her back. Her throat bore a deep incision, still bleeding, while parts of her body retained warmth. Constable John Thane was dispatched to fetch medical aid, and at 4 o'clock Dr. Rhys Llewellyn arrived. His judgment was stark. She had not been dead more than half an hour. Cross and Paul had likely come upon her mere minutes after the killing. What unsettled investigators further was the silence that had preceded discovery. 3 officers had passed through the area within that hour. Constable Neal himself had inspected Bucks Row around 3:15 a.m. Sergeant Henry Kirby had done likewise, and Constable Thane had traversed the end of the street. None reported disturbance or unusual sight. At the mortuary, examination revealed more. Beyond the throat incisions, the victim's abdomen had been cut open. No organs were missing, but Dr. Llewellyn noted multiple incisions across the body and remarked that the wounds suggested some rough anatomical knowledge, for he seemed to have attacked all the vital parts. Identification soon followed. The victim was Mary Ann Nichols, 43 years of age, who had marked her birthday just 5 days earlier. Mother to at least 6 children, her last known address was a lodging house at 56 Flower and Dean Street. On the night of her death she had been refused a bed at Thrall Street, lacking the small sum required. Hoping to raise it through prostitution, she wandered Osborne Street, where she was briefly seen by her acquaintance Ellen Holland. Nichols was visibly drunk, and when they parted near 2:30 a.m., Holland observed her weaving east along Whitechapel Road. Within the hour she lay dead in Bucks Row. The killer had left nothing else. No weapon, no trail, no witness beyond the chance arrival of 2 workmen. Inspector Joseph Helson, charged with the inquiry, summarized bleakly, "Not an atom of evidence can be obtained to connect any person with the crime." Yet the ferocity of the attack did not stand in isolation. Only weeks before, Martha Tabram had been murdered under equally violent circumstances. Both women were prostitutes of similar age, their deaths marked by excessive cruelty and absence of motive. The method differed. Tabram stabbed repeatedly, Nichols mutilated with slashes, but the pattern was too close to ignore. Among investigators, suspicion hardened into conviction. One hand had guided both blades, and that hand had not yet finished. At dawn on September 8, 1888, John Richardson made his way to work. Before continuing, he stopped at 29 Hanbury Street, where his mother was a tenant. Passing through the front hall and into the yard, he sat on the back steps. Producing a knife, he trimmed a piece of leather from his boot. Satisfied, he rose and shut the door behind him. An hour later, John Davis, a resident of the 3rd floor, descended to leave for the day. He noticed the front door ajar, the back one shut. When he opened it, the scene that met him was unbearable. The body of a woman lying beneath the steps, her clothes disordered, her figure mutilated beyond recognition. Inspector Joseph Chandler was the first officer to arrive. After a cursory inspection, he summoned a doctor. By 6:30 a.m., Dr. George Phillips examined the body and noted its condition with precision. The throat dissevered deeply, the abdomen entirely laid open. The intestines had been lifted from the cavity and placed on the shoulder of the corpse. The victim was conveyed to the mortuary while Chandler and Phillips searched the yard. Among discarded objects, 3 items near the victim's feet drew attention: a scrap of coarse cloth and 2 combs. They seemed deliberately positioned. The post-mortem revealed further horrors. 2 brass rings had been wrenched from her hand and were missing entirely. Portions of the abdominal organs had also been removed, including the womb. Phillips remarked that the mode in which these portions were extracted showed some anatomical knowledge. At the inquest, this point was pressed. The coroner concluded the injuries had been made by someone with considerable anatomical skill and knowledge. There were no meaningless cuts. No mere slaughterer of animals could have carried out these operations. It must have been someone accustomed to the post-mortem room. The victim was identified as Annie Chapman, approximately 47 years old. She had borne 7 children, only 2 of whom survived her. Homeless and destitute, she lived in a lodging house on Dorset Street. On the night of September 7th, she had been denied entry for lack of 4pence. Escorted away by the watchman, she disappeared into the night. What followed remains unaccounted for. Unlike the earlier murders, witnesses may have glimpsed her final moments. Elizabeth Long testified that at 5:30 a.m. she saw Chapman conversing with a man outside Hanbury Street. His back was turned, his face unseen. She overheard only an exchange of words. His question, "Will you?" and her reply, "Yes." Yet the timing introduced contradiction. Dr. Phillips, on arrival, estimated she had been dead at least 2 hours, placing her death before 4:30 a.m., but Long claimed to have seen her alive an hour later. Richardson further complicated matters. At 4:45 he had sat on the very steps above the murder site, trimming his boot. He insisted no body was present. I could not have failed to notice the deceased if she had been there. Another witness, Albert Kadosh of 27 Hanbury Street, passed through his yard around 5:20. He reported faint voices from the neighbouring side, catching only the word "no." Minutes later he heard something fall against the dividing fence. The timeline splintered. Phillips conceded that his estimate might have been skewed by the chill of the morning and the massive blood loss. If Long and Kadosh were only minutes adrift, then Chapman's death may have occurred near 5:30, just as dawn brightened the East End and windows stood open. In spite of this, the killer managed to operate unseen, mutilate with precision, and even arrange the victim's meager possessions. As the sequence of killings lengthened, public unease escalated into fury. Newspapers ridiculed Scotland Yard. One wrote, "The London police and detective force is probably the stupidest in the world." Yet such mockery overlooked the scale of the challenge. The murderer appeared to strike without motive, left no weapon, and was shielded by a district where thousands lived, pressed wall to wall. A reporter summarized with stark imagery: "A man in the East End of London is a grain of sand, as I bear, visible and almost as much beyond identification amid the masses." It was a truth soon to be underscored. On the night of September 30th, the terror reached its climax. On the night of September 29th, a routine meeting concluded at a socialist club on Berner Street. By midnight, most members had dispersed, leaving a handful to linger with drink and talk. Around 12:30, Joseph Larve stepped outside through Dutfield's yard for air, remaining there for nearly 10 minutes before returning inside. Soon after, another member, Maurice Eagle, re-entered the building through the same passage. Neither observed anything unusual. At approximately 1 o'clock a.m., Louis Diemschutz, steward of the club, returned by pony cart. As he steered into Dutefield's yard, his animal suddenly veered aside. Striking a match to peer into the darkness, Diemschutz saw the form of a woman lying against the wall. Unsure whether she was drunk or dead, he first sought his wife inside the club, then raised the alarm. A crowd of members quickly gathered. The woman's throat had been cut so deeply that blood streamed down the yard. Eagle and others rushed to summon police, but the perpetrator was gone. Less than a kilometre west, at nearly the same moment, another discovery was imminent. Constable Edward Watkins entered Mitre Square at 1:30 during his regular beat, found it empty, and moved on. When he returned at 1:44, the square had become a killing ground. I turned to the right and saw the body of a woman lying there on her back. Her throat was cut, the bowels protruding, the stomach ripped up. She lay in a pool of blood. Doctors George Sequeira and Frederick Brown examined the scene. The victim's face, throat, and abdomen had been terribly mutilated. Intestines had been drawn out and draped across her shoulder. Brown observed that the lobe and auricle of the right ear was cut obliquely through. Both men agreed she had been killed within minutes of discovery. Back in Dutfield's yard, Dr. Frederick Blackwell and Dr. George Phillips reached the same conclusion. Eli, Zabeth Stride, had died within minutes of being found. Yet Stride's case was unlike the others. She bore only a single wound to the throat, no abdominal mutilations. The proximity of the two murders, less than a kilometre apart and scarcely 45 minutes between them, suggested a chilling possibility. Diemschutz's arrival may have interrupted the killer, who then fled and struck again. Such speculation was never proven, but it persisted. Elizabeth Stride, aged 44, was a Swedish immigrant widowed in London. She had lived by prostitution. Her final address, a lodging house on Flower and Dean Street. On the night of her death she was seen repeatedly, once with a respectably dressed man near 11 o'clock, again with another who looked like a clerk near 11:45, and finally by Constable William Smith at 12:30, walking with a man carrying a small parcel wrapped in newspaper. Whether these sightings referred to the same individual or to different clients could not be determined. One witness gave a more dramatic account. At 12:45, Israel Schwartz passed along Berner Street. He saw a man throw a woman to the ground outside Dutfield's yard. The woman cried out 3 times, though not loudly. Schwartz crossed the street and noticed a second man lighting a pipe. The attacker shouted the word Lipski. Then the pipe smoker appeared to follow Schwartz for some distance. Later, Schwartz identified the woman as Stride. Some officials wondered if the killer had an accomplice. Inspector Aberline offered a different interpretation. Lipski had become a common anti-Semitic insult after the highly publicized execution of Israel Lipski in 1887. He believed the insult was directed at Schwartz, who was of Jewish appearance, and that the man with the pipe was likely an innocent passer-by. Meanwhile, in Mitre Square, Catherine Eddowes had been identified as the second victim. Aged 46, she had borne 5 children but had long since separated from her family. On the evening of September the 29th, she had been arrested for drunkenness in Aldgate High Street, confined to a cell until 1 o'clock a.m., then released. 10 minutes later she was seen with a man near Mitre Square. Joseph Lewend, one of 3 witnesses, described him as sailor-like, with a reddish handkerchief. He saw the woman but not her face. Nevertheless, he later identified her as Eddowes. Minutes after, Watkins discovered the body. The mutilations were severe. The womb and left kidney had been removed. Dr. Brown suggested the extraction required a good deal of knowledge, comparable to a butcher's. Dr. Sequeira disagreed, seeing no great skill. What is beyond dispute is that the killer escaped despite remarkable odds. A police officer's family slept above the square with windows open. A night watchman cleaned a warehouse nearby and heard nothing. Constable James Harvey had glanced directly into the square at 1:04 within the narrow window between sighting and discovery, yet noticed nothing amiss. Whether darkness, shadow, or misjudged minutes, the killer had evaded all eyes. Still, a trace was left behind. Around 3 o'clock a.m., a bloodied scrap of Eddowes's apron was discovered near a doorway a few blocks away. Above it, scrawled in chalk, was a cryptic message: "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The author remains unknown. Whether written by the murderer, intended as misdirection, or wholly unrelated, the meaning remains uncertain. And as the press clamoured, fresh confusion arrived in the form of letters claiming to speak with the voice of Jack the Ripper. 3 days before the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, the Central News Agency of London received a curious letter. Its anonymous author claimed responsibility for the Whitechapel killings and promised more to come, referring ominously to the next job. In the wake of the double event of September 30th, the agency received a second communication, a postcard smeared with what appeared to be blood, repeating details of the crimes and describing them in those very words. A double event. Unsure whether the letters were authentic, police released them to the public, hoping the handwriting might be recognized. None ever was. What the disclosure did achieve was to give permanence to a name signed at the bottom: Jack the Ripper. From the beginning, doubts arose. The first note, later known as the Dear Boss letter, promised to clip the lady's ears off and send them to police. No such package arrived. Yet Eddowes had been found with her right earlobe cut through at an angle. Was this a failed attempt to fulfill the promise, or merely one of many lacerations, coincidental in nature? No certainty could be drawn. Modern linguistic study suggests the Dear Boss letter and the so-called Saucy Jackie postcard were written by the same hand, but neither bore resemblance to the chalk message discovered above the fragment of Eddowes' apron. Publication of the letters provoked a deluge of imitations. Agencies across London were flooded with copycat correspondence. Most were dismissed, but one later delivery forced closer scrutiny. On October 16th, George Lusk, chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a group of tradesmen formed to catch the killer, received a parcel. Inside was a cardboard box containing half of a human kidney, accompanied by a letter. Doctors who examined the specimen confirmed it was human. Whether it was the same left kidney excised from Eddowes could not be established. The possibility of a hoax remained, perhaps a medical student or someone with access to anatomical material. The letter's author insisted the kidney was Eddowes's, claiming to have fried and eaten the other half. This grotesque boast unsettled investigators and public alike. Theories soon pointed not to the Ripper, but to the press. Chief Inspector John Littlechild described the letters as a smart piece of journalistic work. Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson dismissed them as the creation of an enterprising London journalist. Chief Constable Melville McNarton likewise suspected the stained forefinger of the journalist. Candidates were named, but none with proof. Whether forged by the Ripper himself or fabricated by others, the letters achieved their effect. Newspapers published them widely, feeding public hysteria and cementing the killer's moniker in print. For much of October they dominated discourse. Yet the month passed without another murder bearing the hallmarks of Whitechapel's terror. Speculation followed swiftly. "It is pretty certain that the monster has become frightened," wrote one paper, "and has suspended his horrible work for the present, if not for good." It was a hope soon to be extinguished. On the morning of November the 9th, 1888, John McCarthy, a shopkeeper and landlord of Miller's Court, turned to his accounts. Room 13 had fallen into arrears, and he dispatched his assistant Thomas Bowyer to collect the rent at 11:15. Bowyer knocked twice without reply. Circling to a side window, he found his view obscured. Reaching through a broken pane, he drew back a covering and froze. Inside lay the mutilated body of a woman, sprawled on a bed in the corner of the room. Police converged swiftly upon the court. The door to room 13 was locked. It was forced open with a pickaxe. What they found was described in words that faltered under the weight of the sight. The sight we saw, I cannot drive away from my mind. It looked more like the work of a devil than of a man. The whole scene is more than I can describe. I hope I may never see such a sight again. Dr. George Phillips said the body was cut all to pieces. Dr. Thomas Bond wrote that the face was hacked beyond recognition. The throat had been severed to the bone, the abdomen emptied of viscera, and organs dispersed about the room. The scene was monstrous in its disfigurement. The furnishings offered little in the way of clues. 2 tables, a few chairs, a small cabinet. Ashes in the fireplace contained scraps of burned clothing. Whether these were attempts at destroying evidence or simply fuel for warmth could not be determined. The victim was identified at once as Mary Jane Kelly, tenant of the room. Almost everything about her life remains uncertain. She was likely of Welsh or Irish origin, in her mid-20s, the youngest of the known victims, and may have lived under a false name. Until October 30th, she had cohabited with Joseph Barnett, who left after quarrels over her prostitution and the company she kept. Yet Barnett visited again on November 8th, finding her in the presence of another woman. Accounts vary on who she was, when Barnett arrived, and how long he stayed. Later that night, Kelly was seen with a man by her neighbour, Mary Ann Cox. Kelly was heavily intoxicated, scarcely able to reply to Cox's good night as she entered the room. Inside, Kelly sang aloud, so loudly that Cox still heard her as she departed again an hour later. At around 2:00 a.m., George Hutchinson, an acquaintance, encountered Kelly outside. She asked for money, but he had none to give. Soon after, he watched her approached by a well-dressed man. Suspicious that such a figure would seek her company, Hutchinson observed them closely. He recalled the gloves in the man's right hand, a small parcel in his left, and a red handkerchief handed to Kelly. She said, "All right, my dear, come along, you will be comfortable." Hutchinson followed them to Miller's Court, lingering until 3:00 a.m., but they did not reappear. Around the same hour, Cox returned and noted the silence from Kelly's room, where before there had been a song. At approximately 4:00 a.m., a tenant above and a woman across the way heard faint cries of "murder," yet others in the court heard nothing. The time of death remains contested. Dr. Bond placed it between 1 and 2 o'clock. Dr. Phillips argued for later. Some witnesses even claimed to have seen or spoken to Kelly well into the morning, as late as 8 or 10 o'clock. Her body, however, was not discovered until 11:15. These contradictions remain unresolved. Mary Jane Kelly is regarded as the Ripper's final victim. Along with Nichols, Chapman, Stride, and Eddowes, she forms the group known as the Canonical Five. Some argue Martha Tabram belongs among them. Others dispute even the five themselves. The true number of victims remains a matter of debate. If Kelly was indeed the last, the sudden cessation demands explanation. Did the killer fear discovery? Were they imprisoned on another charge? Did illness or suicide remove them from the streets? Perhaps they left England altogether, or altered their methods to confound investigators. The possibilities are endless. The questions remain. In the wake of Mary Ann Nichols's murder, rumour attached the crimes to a figure known only as Leather Apron, a man said to menace prostitutes in the East End. The name spread quickly through the press, and for a time it rivaled all others as the killer's identity. But the man so accused, John Pizer, was soon cleared. On the night Nichols was slain, he had been elsewhere in London. The hunt for Leather Apron was emblematic of the larger investigation. Scotland Yard pursued even the faintest trace, driven by scarce evidence and relentless public pressure. Thousands were questioned, hundreds investigated, and theories multiplied without end. Inspector Frederick Aberline later admitted, "Theories. We were lost almost in theories. There were so many of them." To impose order, the police attempted what would now be recognized as early criminal profiling. Dr. Thomas Bond examined the evidence and produced a description. A strong, middle-aged man, respectably dressed, with an inoffensive appearance. Bond's most disputed conclusion was that the killer possessed no scientific nor anatomical knowledge, contradicting colleagues who believed the mutilations required at least basic anatomical skill. Witness accounts offered little clarity. Aggregated together, they suggested a man of average height, medium to stout build, in his late 20s to mid-30s, with a moustache and dark clothing topped by a hat. Yet the details varied widely. Witnesses may not have seen the killer at all. For every consistent trait, others conflicted. The possibility even arose that the murderer was not a man at all, but a woman or a man in disguise. Such Jill the Ripper theories never gained firm ground. One point met with broader agreement. The killer likely knew the East End intimately. His escapes suggested familiarity with side streets and patrol routes. The timing of the murders, clustered on weekends and holidays, hinted at regular employment. His precise mutilations pointed, at minimum, to comfort with knives. Modern profilers have built upon these assumptions. FBI agent John Douglas concluded that Jack the Ripper was local and almost certainly interviewed by police. If so, the murderer may have stood among witnesses or associates of the victims. John Richardson was one such figure. In Annie Chapman's case, he sat on the very steps where her body was later discovered, trimming a boot. Though suspected briefly, police found not a shred of evidence against him. His mother lived there, explaining his presence. George Hutchinson was another. He claimed to have followed Mary Jane Kelly after she was approached by a well-dressed man. He never clarified why. He said only that the sight surprised him. Was it curiosity, jealousy, financial motive? Hutchinson admitted he was destitute, while the client appeared wealthy. Perhaps he intended to rob the man. Perhaps he lingered for reasons unstated. His testimony was detailed, yet his identity remained obscure. Interrogated, he ultimately persuaded Abeline of his truthfulness. Not all witnesses faced such scrutiny. Consider Charles Cross, the man who discovered Mary Ann Nichols in Bucks Row. On the morning of August 31st, 1888, Charles Cross left his home on Doveton Street and began his routine walk to work. Turning into Bucks Row, he came upon the body of Mary Ann Nichols. Soon after, Robert Paul joined him, and together they took the steps already described in earlier testimony. At the time, Cross drew no suspicion. Both press and police accepted him as nothing more than a passer-by who happened upon tragedy. Yet in later years, this assumption has been revisited. A theory has emerged that Cross may have been interrupted in the very act of killing Nichols when Paul's footsteps approached. The idea suggests that Cross concealed a weapon, presented himself as a discoverer of the crime, and played the role convincingly enough to escape further inquiry. The injuries to Nichols, less severe than those inflicted upon later victims, have been interpreted by some as consistent with an interrupted assault. What complicates matters is that Cross may not have testified under his true name. He identified himself as a carman, residing at 22 Doveton Street. Surviving records indicate that the address was occupied by a man named Charles Lechmere, who also worked as a carman. Lechmere had occasionally used the surname Cross, the name of his stepfather. It is widely believed today that the man known as Cross at the inquest was, in fact, Charles Lechmere. His reasons for doing so remain uncertain. Was it deliberate concealment, or simply the casual adoption of a name he used interchangeably? Contemporary examples of men employing both birth and step-family surnames are not uncommon. The most compelling point raised against Lechmere is geographic. His daily route to work aligned with the locations and timing of several murders. The exceptions were the killings of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, which occurred on a Sunday, his day free from employment. All the murder, Mars clustered around weekends and holidays, further complicating the argument that the killings coincided with his work commute. Lechmere's family ties also placed him near the scene of Stride's murder. His mother lived only a few streets from Berner Street, where he had spent much of his childhood. Some have speculated that Stride and Eddowes were attacked after a nocturnal visit to his mother. As for his work, Cross, Lechmere claimed employment with Pickford's, a prominent delivery firm, though no records survive to confirm it. If true, he may have hauled meat, which would have given him familiarity with blood and carcasses. Lechmere remained in East London for the rest of his life, dying in 1920 at the age of 71. No evidence suggests that he was ever formally suspected by police, but with so many investigative records lost, any doubts they may have entertained are now erased by time. Attention, meanwhile, did fall more heavily upon another man, Joseph Barnett. Joseph Barnett lived with Mary Jane Kelly until their separation, only days before her murder. They were said to have met in April of 1887 and eventually moved together into 13 Miller's Court. Barnett worked as a fish porter, but between July and August of 1888 he lost his position. From that moment, the couple's financial strain worsened, and Kelly returned to prostitution. Those who regard Barnett as the Ripper point to this dismissal as a decisive turning point. The theory claims Barnett, burdened with guilt at driving Kelly back to the streets, sought to terrify her into abandoning prostitution by murdering others in her trade. Each killing would then be viewed as a grotesque attempt to frighten her into retreat. Though largely speculative, Barnett's disapproval of her work is well attested. He separated from her on October 30th, stating plainly, "Kelly never went on the streets when she lived with me. She would never have gone wrong again, and I should never have left, if it had not been for the prostitutes stopping by the house." By this reasoning, Kelly's murder, more brutal than all others, was revenge for rejection. Yet Barnett insisted otherwise. He claimed to have visited Kelly on the evening of November 8th, departing on friendly terms. He said he then played cards until midnight before going to bed. But Kelly is believed to have died in the early hours of November the 9th, leaving open the possibility that Barnett returned after midnight. Police interrogated him for 4 hours before releasing him without charge. Still, questions lingered, especially over the locked door. Authorities forced entry with a pickaxe, prompting debate over how the murderer had secured the room. Barnett explained that the key had been missing for some time, and that he and Kelly had routinely opened the door by reaching through a broken pane. The lock, he claimed, was a self-fastening catch. If so, the mystery dissolves. Even if the door did not lock automatically, a killer could have imitated the same method Barnett described. Those who view Barnett as guilty suggest another possibility, that the key had never been lost, but stolen by him and used on the night of the crime. A related variation argues that Barnett killed Kelly alone, imitating the Ripper's signature to deflect suspicion. The fact that her murder occurred indoors, unlike the others, lends some weight to this divergence. Barnett remained in the East End until his death in 1926 at the age of 68. Whether innocent or complicit, his proximity to Kelly ensured suspicion. But Victorian detectives also looked outward, considering whether the Ripper was not merely jealous or vengeful, but insane. Among the prime suspects in that category was Aaron Kosminski. The investigation into the Whitechapel murders drew the attention of several senior officials at Scotland Yard. Among them was Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson. After his retirement, Anderson spoke with certainty. There was no doubt whatever as to the identity of the criminal. He would not give a name, but described the suspect as a low-class Polish Jew who had been safely caged in an asylum. According to him, the identification was made by the only witness ever to obtain a clear view of the killer. This witness, however, refused to testify on account of the suspect being a fellow Jew. Anderson added, "I'm almost tempted to disclose the identity of the murderer, but no public benefit would result from such a course." While Anderson withheld the name, his colleagues were less guarded. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson noted in his marginalia that the suspect was called Kosminski. Chief Constable Melville McNaughton likewise referred to Kosminski, describing him as a homicidal, misogynistic resident of Whitechapel. Records confirm that one Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-born Jew living in the district, was admitted to a psychiatric asylum in 1891. He suffered from auditory hallucinations, was plagued by paranoia, and feared being fed by others. Though trained as a barber, he had not attempted any kind of work for years. His behavior in confinement was generally quiet, apathetic, and well-behaved, though occasionally agitated or violent. Before his commitment, he had once threatened his sister with a knife. The case against Aaron rests almost entirely upon the recollections of Anderson, Swanson, and McNaughton, yet inconsistencies abound. McNaughton wrote that the suspect had been removed to a lunatic asylum about March 1889. Aaron, however, was not confined until 1891. Swanson claimed the suspect had died soon after incarceration, but Aaron lived nearly 3 decades longer, dying in 1919 at the age of 53. These contradictions raise the possibility that the suspect named Kosminski was not Aaron at all, or that memories had blurred over the years. McNaughton admitted his notes were written from recollection. Anderson alone appeared wholly convinced. Others were not. McNaughton later wrote that many homicidal maniacs were suspected, but no shadow of proof could be thrown on anyone. Inspector Edmund Reed dismissed Anderson's conclusion outright. Now we have Sir Robert Anderson saying that Jack the Ripper was a Jew, that I challenge him to prove. I challenge anyone to prove that there was a tittle of evidence against man, woman, or child. Decades later, Aaron Kosminski's name returned to prominence through controversial DNA claims. The story begins in 1888, when Acting Sergeant Amos Simpson allegedly removed a blood-stained shawl from the scene of Catherine Eddowes' murder. Passed down through generations, the item resurfaced in 2011 for DNA testing. Mitochondrial DNA was extracted and compared with maternal descendants of both Eddowes and Kosminski, producing reported matches. News coverage declared the case definitively solved. Yet the flaws were numerous. No record places Simpson at the crime scene, nor does evidence confirm any shawl was recovered there. A destitute woman like Eddowes was unlikely to own such an expensive article. More importantly, mitochondrial DNA is not unique. It can be shared by thousands, and, in the words of one geneticist, based on mitochondrial DNA, one can only exclude a suspect. The evidence cannot specifically identify one individual. In summary, a suspect named Kosminski was once identified by an unnamed witness. This persuaded Anderson, though not his colleagues. Aaron Kosminski was institutionalized, occasionally violent, but never proven to have committed the crimes. The DNA evidence neither convicts nor absolves him. He spent his remaining years in care until his death in 1919. But Kosminski was not the only suspect advanced by senior officers. Another name arose belonging to a man of entirely different character, Francis Tumblety. 2 days before the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, an American physician named Francis Tumblety was arrested in London. Born in Ireland around 1833 and raised in the United States, he cultivated notoriety as a self-styled Indian herb doctor. His advertisements promised cures for ailments ranging from indigestion to blindness, all through herbal remedies. Behind this facade, Tumblety was repeatedly accused of crimes: assault, theft, manslaughter of a patient, and even inducing miscarriage. At one point, he was briefly implicated in the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, though cleared of suspicion. In the 1860s, Tumblety was alleged to have hosted a men-only dinner in Washington where he voiced hatred of women. He was also said to have kept a cabinet filled with anatomical specimens, including, reportedly, wombs preserved in jars. In 1869, he travelled to England for the first time, boasting of his knowledge of London's streets. He styled himself the Great American Doctor, clashed occasionally with police, and moved restlessly between continents, adopting false names. By the autumn of 1888, Tumblety was once again in London. His movements during the time of the Whitechapel murders remain unverified. One tale describes a mysterious lodger who abandoned a blood-stained shirt near the site of Elizabeth Stride's murder. Some later speculated this lodger was Tumblety. No reliable evidence supports the claim. What is certain is that on November 7th he was arrested. Both the press and Tumblety himself reported that suspicion of being Jack the Ripper was among the charges. 2 days later, Kelly was murdered. It remains unclear whether Tumblety was then in custody or already free on bail. Ultimately, he was charged not with murder, but with 4 counts of gross indecency. Choosing to flee trial, he crossed the Channel under an alias, boarded a steamship, and escaped to Amerit. Pursued by detectives, he remained beyond reach, his offences not extraditable. He never returned to England. The parallels were tempting. Tumblety was said to despise women and rumoured to collect wombs. The Ripper had removed wombs from 2 victims. Yet the strongest link rests on a December 1888 article quoting Charles Dunham, a known liar and forger with convictions for perjury. Much of the evidence portraying Tumblety as a misogynistic collector derives from Dunham's words. Other discrepancies weaken the case. Witnesses describe the Ripper as of average stature and build. Tumblety was notably tall, flamboyant, and fond of military dress, hardly a man to pass unnoticed in Whitechapel alleys. Still, witness testimony has always been unreliable. Another curiosity arose after Tumblety's death in 1903. Among his possessions were many valuables, but also a pair of cheap imitation rings. 2 brass rings had been taken from Annie Chapman's body, perhaps as trophies. Could Tumblety's rings have been the same? Possible, but unprovable. Chief Inspector John Littlechild once referred to Tumblety as a very likely suspect. His notoriety, eccentricity, and presence in London at the time of the murders made him an obvious candidate. Yet the case against him rests on rumour, contradiction, and self-promotion. A charlatan by trade, Tumblety blurred truth and falsehood so freely that certainty about him is impossible. To speculate on the identity of Jack the Ripper is to enter a labyrinth of hearsay, contradiction, and conjecture. Entire volumes have been filled with suspects, and with each passing year the list only expands. Hundreds of names have been proposed, only a handful merit more than cursory attention. Among them are writers, artists, physicians, and even figures of nobility. Such theories, elaborate in scope, strain against the simple plausibility of a man like Charles Lechmere, an ordinary carman walking to work at dawn. Yet certainty remains elusive. Even the suspects most often discussed can be argued against with equal conviction. Those omitted fare no better. Each rests upon fragments of circumstance, never upon proof. In a city like London, the world's largest port, a metropolis of millions, its streets dense with transients and the unrecorded, anonymity was effortless. It is not difficult to imagine one man, obscure and unremarkable, vanishing into Whitechapel's alleys. Sailor, butcher, medic, soldier, barber, merchant, porter, clerk, carman, or watchman. A grain of sand, indistinguishable amid the masses. And there, perhaps, the Ripper remains. Before we close, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Gothic Ledger for more journeys into history's most unsettling archives.